Hey everybody out there, my name is Dragnix, and I have a game design video for you today. Now, many of you are probably having a fun and relaxing weekend this last Saturday and Sunday. You are probably playing a new game, or spending time with your loved ones. As for myself, I was playing more Stranger of Sword City, because apparently I like to torture myself. But let me be more specific, I was grinding in Stranger of Sword City. I'm on the last dungeon of the game, which consists of 4 bosses. At the start of the weekend, I was on the second boss, and I finally beat that second boss early Monday morning. Most of the other time was spent leveling up, getting equipment, and just arming myself up so I could actually take on that boss. So needless to say, I did so much grinding this weekend that if I was using a whetstone, there would be literally nothing left of it. Sitting there doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, gaining little by little experience as I slowly made my character stronger in what seemed to be a never-ending cycle of baddies. In the modern-day video game environment, grinding is mostly associated with bad game design, or at least something that you should avoid altogether if you can help it. It's associated with repetitive and boring gameplay, and unnecessary in the modern day RPG. Many believe that good battle design and appropriate leveling systems that adjust your enemies to your current level is a much better way to handle these RPG combat systems. And in those variety of cases, I would agree, mostly. But is all grinding bad? In particular, is it bad in the modern day RPG setting? I would argue no. Granted, it has to be implemented correctly and in the right circumstances. If you implemented it how Stranger of Sword City implemented it, I tell you to take the code you had written, trash it, and then set the computer that you were working on fire. Just to make sure that abomination wouldn't end up corrupting any of your other work by sheer proximity. Okay, but how do you make grinding work? Well, to me, a prime example of a good way that grinding can help a game is an experience I had back while I was in high school. The good old days of Final Fantasy X. Now granted, Final Fantasy X has a spear grid system, but it ended up working very similar to a traditional leveling system, focusing on stats rather than traditional levels. But the outcome was relatively the same, you just had a bit more control of how you could build your character. Specifically, there's one fight that I remember, the battle with Lady Yunalesca towards the middle of the game. I remember having little to no trouble with the game up to that point, but being stopped dead in my tracks right there. Not only did I have to deal with a new strategy of zombie and cure combos that the boss threw at me, but I remember being outmatched in general, as one good Curaga spell would knock my team flat on their back and I couldn't recover. And eventually, Lady Yunalesca fell. After all the hard work I'd put in, I had won via the skin of my teeth. I remember Lulu being the sole survivor, barely hanging on to the little health she had as the victory music played in triumph. I remember getting up, cheering loudly, and slamming my controller on the bed. And then getting yelled at for stomping the floor and yelling loudly at 10 p.m. at night. That was my bad. But you're asking yourself, wouldn't the fight have worked with the boss being scaled in stats to your level anyway? I mean, you still had to deal with the odd strategy in the fight, using the right actions at the right time. It's just that sheer numbers recorded in the system and how much I improved them wouldn't be what determined the fight. It'd be my specific actions. So why am I saying that grinding in this case was not only acceptable, but it made the game much better in the process? Well, in my mind, there are 5 key factors to take into account when using a grinding mechanic in your game. Oddly enough, I've come up with an acronym for it labeled GRIND. Clever, I know. Each letter will describe an element important to the core of how to make grinding work, in particular with an RPG. Now, grinding can go outside the bounds of RPGs, and you can still apply this list to those games, but I will be focusing on RPGs for the remainder of this video. The G in grind stands for goal. One of the most important elements regarding grinding is a clear and obtainable goal, without a lot of distractions to that goal. In the case of my Final Fantasy X example, it's a story-based quest that I have to complete in order to move on in the game into the next area. Sure, there are other quests that I can take up in areas before then, but the game bottlenecks my movement into the next area here, so I have to beat it. And while there's enemies up to this point, this specific boss is the end of this major area in terms of a difficulty hurdle. Get past him, and I'm free to move forward, so I have a clear goal to reach, which is important in terms of grinding. See, one of the major reasons why you don't see grinding in more modern and Western RPGs is how open world they've become, and how that affects the goal aspect of the game. Let's take a prime example like Fallout 4. While there are story elements and required missions in the game, there's plenty to do and see, and missions that you can run across in multiple ways. Hell, even getting to a story quest can be very unique to the individual and how he or she travels, so the goals and sub-goals for that player may vary wildly. In those travels, there's plenty of times you'll run across enemies that are way too tough for you, and it's a good indication that you probably shouldn't be there. The whole skull over their head thing. The thing is, you can grind over and over again in areas you have discovered in order to take on this new area, but with so many other choices and goals available, it's hard to justify the time spent there. Just go do another quest and gain the experience that way and come back later on. With multiple goals available, there's no reason to spend so much time on this one right now. Now, you may think in the case of my weekend of Stranger of Sword City grinding that it would actually pass this requirement. I have to defeat that boss in order to get through the final area, so it's a clear goal. But the thing is, there's another boss in the tower that I have to defeat at this point. I can choose either part of the tower, and now I have to wonder, is it better for me to go after the other part of the tower and fight that boss? Maybe I can take him on right now. And if I win, hopefully I gain enough experience that I'm strong enough so that I can take on the other one. And hence the point. Even with that one new goal introduced, my focus is much less clear, and now it leads me to wondering what I should be grinding for, and if it's necessary. And once I start questioning if the grinding is useful to me, then I'm not going to enjoy it as much as I'll have questions in the back of my head. So if you want grinding to work, you need to minimize the distractions and goals available to the player, or focus on a requirement that forces them into the situation that they'll appreciate once the grinding is done. The R in grind stands for repeatability. Now you're probably saying to yourself, isn't that one of the problems with grinding, that it gets boring and monotonous over time because of a lack of variety? Well, to an extent you're right, but that's not necessarily what I'm referring to. What I'm referring to is the actual battle that you're grinding for. In order for your grinding to feel effective, that battle has to play out relatively the same over time, or it's going to make the actual grinding less effective if it's not. Confused? Let me explain with the two prime examples I've used up to this point. In the Lady Yunalesca fight, you can break down the fight into 3 phases, and each phase has its own set of strategies. While there is some randomization in terms of skills during those phases, in general, there's a core set of actions that the enemies take during those phases. You're not going to see Yunalesca put the party into a zombie status in the first phase. It isn't programmed that way. You have to reach the second phase of the fight in order to see that, and hence my point. As you grind and get stronger, you most likely will be able to get further and further in the fight on a consistent basis. You should make incremental progress, getting 50% through, 60% through, so on and so forth. Sure, there's always luck involved with things like critical hits, but you always will chuck it up to bad luck if that happens. The key here is that you can see that your grinding has worked. You are making progress little by little, and there's no reason that it shouldn't continue in future attempts. But what about Stranger of Sword City, where the battle is more dynamic? Sure, there's a set of skills that each boss has, but there's no phases to the fight, and the skills are seemingly used at random. This leads to more combat situations that you'll have to react to on the fly, and a more dynamic fight, which would seemingly be a good thing. But herein lies the rub. How do you measure your progress based on a dynamic fight? These next set of 5 boss attempts could easily be worse than the last, thanks to the right combinations of skills used by the boss. Sure, you standing up could help that, but if you can't see yourself knocking off 30%, 50% health on a consistent basis, you start questioning if the levels are truly the problem, and not your strategy. It makes the grinding less important because you don't know if you are getting stronger in the long run. And again, one of the keys to making grinding work is to make it feel like it was purposeful and required. And the more dynamic your combat system is in terms of random strategy, the harder it is to implement grinding in a meaningful way. The I stands for Indomitable, which seems like it shouldn't be in this list. Its literal definition is impossible to subdue or defeat. If I'm grinding forever against an enemy that's indomitable, then what's the point of grinding? Well, again, I'm using the word in a different way here. It isn't that the challenge should be indomitable itself, but that overcoming the experience makes you feel that way. That after all your hard work and after everything that you went through, that your victory makes you feel like you're on top of the mountain and no one can beat you. Again, note in my original example how I got up and shouted because I had won against Lady Yunalesca. What this ends up doing is making you feel like a badass and makes every single moment of grinding seemingly pay off. Think of the Rocky movies and the montages of him training for the big fight. He's grinding in a way, working his butt off to make sure that he's ready for that big fight. And after all the training and all the grinding, it's much more satisfying to see him meet his goal than just watching the fight itself. And it's the same thing in games, whether it's proving that you can hang with the best of them after putting hours and hours in on a game, or overcoming a seemingly unbeatable challenge. And that's the thing, it has to be followed up with a lull in terms of difficulty to keep that feeling going for some period of time. If you immediately throw another big boss that's even harder right after this one, you take the risk of the player losing that feeling. It's possible that they feel confident enough to take on that next boss and beat it, of course. But if they abruptly get knocked off the mountain, now they feel like shit. Then they question if they have to grind all over again, and whether or not there's going to be another challenge right around the corner after they beat this one. This is what Stranger of Sword City gets wrong so consistently. Yes, did I have a feel of empowerment after I beat the second boss? Yeah, only to realize that the next portion was giving me new struggles. I had no time to enjoy my victory and appreciate the grinding that I did in order to get there, because I was right back to it in order to get through the next challenge. Basically, you know how they say that absence makes the heart grow fonder? Well, it applies here too. Let them appreciate what they accomplished by not having them grind for at least a couple of hours. It makes that time much more important, and again, that's what you need to emphasize when you put grinding sections in your game. The N in grind stands for necessity. Now, I've touched on it in some of the other letters before this one, but when it comes down to it, the grinding in question has to feel purposeful in order for it to work in the overall picture. Now, I want to make this clear. That does not mean you force grinding on the player. What it means is simple, that with the choices that the player made in the game up to that point, that grinding is the most reasonable answer. Sure, I might have changed things early on to avoid grinding, but the choices I made at the time were reasonable, and the game didn't force me into this situation. I got there myself. This may sound hard to quantify, but let me give a prime example with Stranger of Sword City. There's a class change mechanic in the game where you sacrifice half of your levels and can change to something other than your current class. Now, this has benefits, as you can assign skills from previous classes to make a super class of sorts, and the game presents you this option early on. But there's a catch. See, if I want some of the strongest powers in a class, I've got to level them up significantly and not change classes. So the game presents that as two different options of equal strength, and it's really up to you how to play. Except it's not. See, the problem here has to do with leveling itself, aka it's easier to level up a character at lower ranks. Now stats wise, you don't gain new stats like strength and agility with these level ups until you get back to the highest level you've been at. Except for HP. And while HP gets cut when you level down, it seems to be at a rate lower than the HP you gain on leveling. AKA, the more you class change, the more health you seem to get out of it. Which means, guess what? It's really beneficial to class change as often as possible. But to see the full skill set of the game, I chose to class change less frequently, which caused me major problems in terms of HP. This forced me to grind a lot more than I believe I would have if I class changed often, and this is where the necessity I'm talking about comes into play. I feel that the grinding was forced upon me, and I have no way to avoid it because of a lack of information. It wasn't because I ignored something important and chose to play in a completely different manner than it recommended. When the necessity of grinding feels forced upon you, it's a lot less meaningful, because all you can think of is the wasted time of grinding during that time. In the Final Fantasy X case, that wasn't the deal. Sure, could I have eked out a couple of more stats if I knew everything that the game had presented up to that point? Yeah, but not to the point where it would have made a difference on the boss. I felt like that, yeah, I made good decisions, and there's not a way that I could have avoided grinding without sacrificing other parts of my gameplay. So because it feels like it's naturally along the lines of gameplay, I'm more accepting of it, and thus, I probably will appreciate it more. Finally, the D stands for duration, and this one should be obvious. Grinding should never be used to extend gameplay artificially. Grinding should only be used in spurts, as having it happen too often or for too long will keep the player bored. Again, sometimes having a more boring section of gameplay for an hour can make you really appreciate the challenge that comes with the next part. But as the amount of boring, repetitive gameplay increases, the less likely you'll get a payoff from it. In the case of Final Fantasy X, I remember grinding between 1 and 2 hours, which is a reasonable time. Sure, I had fought the enemies before and it was repetitive, but I was engaged long enough and still was ready to take on the boss after the period was over. With the Stranger of Sword City case, it lasted around 8 to 10 hours, which means that I was freaking bored. In fact, I watched the entire season 1 of Scream the TV series during that time. And yes, I love stupid horror shows like that. In the end, I got bored, and even when I finally beat the boss after all this time, it was more of a thank God it's over and I don't have to grind again, rather than a moment of triumph. So that's it for this video. 5 core elements of how grinding can work in a game, and some examples to go along with it. And sadly, Stranger of Sword City is the prime example of how grinding shouldn't work in a game. Mostly. There is one element that does work here, but I'll get to that in the review, which hopefully comes out this week, if I don't have to grind another 20 hours for the next boss. Anyway, I'll see you then, and as always, keep on gaming.